So I would like to welcome everybody in attendance today to the first lecture of the semester in the Emerging Voices in REEES speaker series. So a massive thanks to everybody who is joining us today from wherever in the world you may be. And I would like to give thanks to my partners in crime, as Marietta Božović tends to put it, without whom it would be impossible to have this event. So thank you, Doug Rogers, Marietta Božović, Ginny Chu, Mina Magda, Christina Andriotis, and Asia Nupane. I would also like to thank our sponsors, in particular Yale's program in Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies, the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures, and the European Studies Council of the Macmillan Center. And of course, where would we be without our wonderful speaker for today? And so I would like to give a huge thank you to Dr. Mollie Arbuthnot, who is a research fellow, in both the Department of History and the Department of Slavonic Studies at Jesus College, Cambridge University. Dr. Arbuthnot received her PhD in Russian Studies at the University of Manchester. And before joining Jesus College, Cambridge in 2021, Dr. Arbuthnot taught in the History Department at Durham University. She specializes in visual culture in the early Soviet Union, including mass media, propaganda, and theories of viewership, as well as the history of Soviet multinationalism. Her current research project examines Islamic and Central Asian art at Soviet museums. Today, she will be presenting a part of this project with her lecture entitled Red East, Propaganda Posters for Interwar Soviet Uzbekistan. And as Dr. Arbuthnot gives her presentation, I would encourage you to submit your questions into the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom screen there. And we hope that you stay with us for a rich discussion after the lecture. So please join me in giving a very warm virtual welcome to Dr. Arbuthnot.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. And so huge thank you to Spencer for that very generous introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here, at least virtually, at Yale, and a real honor to be invited to be considered an emerging voice, whatever that means. So yeah, a huge thank you for the invitation. And thank you to all of you who are attending. I can see some familiar and some unfamiliar names in the list. So looking forward to I have an interesting and productive discussion about the topic that I'm going to present today, which is propaganda posters in early Soviet Uzbekistan. I'm just going to share my presentation with you. Is that visible? Can someone confirm that that's there?
Yes.
Great, thank you. So this topic, this project actually developed out of my PhD thesis on this same topic, which I'm actually currently in the process of sort of hacking into something resembling a book. So actually, if you have kind of substantive critique or feedback, I would be very open to hearing it, because I'm in this process of sort of rethinking how I'm approaching and presenting this material at the moment. But so broadly speaking, this I'm interested in the visualization of national and political identity. What does Sovietness look like? What does Sovietness in Uzbekistan look like? Is it different? I argue that it is different. And then what does that difference mean? So really, I'm using this kind of case study to think about how the visual, how images are used to communicate by looking at the very particular conditions of this former colony of the Russian Empire in the process, in this period of becoming a new Soviet republic. I just want to start off by looking at this poster. It's a pretty early poster published in 1918. As you can see on screen, depicting this sort of unholy trinity, the enemies of progress, the Tsar, the priest, and the kulak. It was actually issued in 12 editions in 12 different languages, corresponding to different linguistic groups in the Russian Empire. So it's been translated linguistically. But what I find interesting is that there's also an act of visual translation going on here, a pretty simplistic one perhaps, but the substitution of these figures on either side of the Tsar with different types of social category. So on the right-hand side, I've given the example of the version in the Lithuanian language, where the kulak, the wealthy peasant, has been replaced by this sort of top-hatted bourgeois with his gold watch chain and exuberant facial hair, with this assumption that the visual signs of a different type of person might be more easily recognizable in a different context. One of the editions of this poster, the one in the Tatar language, and worth noting actually that this is the only one of the set intended for any of the Muslim populations of the former Russian Empire. There isn't, for example, a Turkey edition of this poster. But as you can see, the Tatar edition is a little bit different. The translation, the visual translation, is more awkward. Rather than the simple substitution of figures, we have here their addition. So as well as an Orthodox priest, we have a Muslim cleric, and as well as the Russian kulak, we have a boy or wealthy landowner, as he is identified in the text. So in this case, this artist has evidently somewhat struggled to fit the square peg of their perception of Tatar society into the round hole of the quite rigid structure of this poster. Had to change the kind of strictly class-based triumvirate to incorporate different kinds of social categories. So this poster, or this set of posters rather, encapsulates quite nicely a few issues. One of which is the sense that the Bolsheviks at this stage are trying to speak to people in their language, as it were, to take account of ethnic and cultural diversity, and not to address the population as an undifferentiated mass, but also that this act of translating their political ideology had perhaps additional complications when it came to the Muslim populations of the former empire. There is a sense of greater cultural distance, real or perceived, that seems to be problematic. And this sense of difficulty also comes through elsewhere in this early period. It's echoed by the first substantive Bolshevik propaganda campaign in Central Asia, the Red East, the Krasny Vostok train, the name of which I've clearly stolen for the title of this talk today, which sets off around the then Turkestan in 1920, at a time when swathes of Central Asia had up until then been cut off from most of revolutionary Russia. And so we can see it really as this kind of moment of reconquest, perhaps, of the region in military, but to my mind, much more interestingly, kind of conceptual and cultural terms. This is really the beginning of Soviet propaganda and educational projects, among which projects is this train, which, as I said, trundled around what was then Turkestan in 1920, doing what propaganda campaigns did, distributing leaflets, books, reading materials, posters, holding rallies, having speakers evangelizing for Bolshevism. But the reports written by the agitators working on this train record that they were confronted by what they felt was a huge, perhaps even insurmountable cultural gulf between themselves. And it's worth noting that these are urban and certainly Russophone, if not necessarily ethnic Russian, people working on this train at this time. So this huge gulf that they felt to exist between themselves and the local rural population. They record that the people were perhaps idly curious, but not really getting what the agitators were trying to convey about the momentousness of revolution, or the importance of mobilizing for the socialist future. And they came, interestingly, to the conclusion that a process of socialist colonization is what would transform the region. Infuriatingly, from a historian's point of view, they never explain what they mean by socialist colonization, which is a real shame, because that would be fascinating to know. But in any case, there's this, again, a sense of kind of the difficulty of propaganda work in this context. these raise a number of questions for me, which I felt were not really being, or hadn't really been addressed in the literature. Despite the fact that both agitational vehicles like this train and of course Soviet posters have attracted a huge amount of attention in the scholarship over the decades, I felt that none of it really explained this particular cultural front, to use Soviet terminology, or what we might perhaps think of as the problems of transcultural communication in this particular context of post-revolutionary Central Asia, neither quite colonial nor post-colonial, and also how a new vision of socialist nationhood, Soviet Uzbekistan, was imagined. And to me, it also highlights the role of the visual in all of this. I think we often have a flawed but very widespread assumption that images are more easily comprehensible across cultural or linguistic divides, which it kind of much more easily comprehensible than the written word, the sense of ease. And yet when we actually look at this material, even just the two quick examples of this train and the poster I've already discussed today, ease is not something that comes across. And so that was the starting point for this project for me, really. Like, what was this, how was this problem, or this kind of perceived problem, addressed? So my talk today is going to focus on two main themes. The first is the idea of the national viewer. So this kind of imagined way in which national subjects see and perceive images. And then I'm going to talk about national bodies, so the actual kind of visual depiction of nationality, most often kind of through the frame of a human body. So I've taken this perceived crisis, this anxiety about transcultural communication as my starting point, rather than, say, border delimitation or indigenization program, or indeed the way in which local elites might have imagined the national community. Because if we're thinking of nation building in Soviet Central Asia as a state project, and a project that's very closely linked to broader campaigns of enlightenment and the mobilization of the population, then this question of how do we communicate our ideas to the masses that totally dominates the discourse. And it is framed from this perspective, this outsider perspective. How do we convey our political ideology to them, the viewer? The kind of the mechanism of othering is really built into this whole discussion of propaganda in the national republics. And one thing underpinning the whole theory behind this idea of the national viewer, there's this really pervasive idea that people fundamentally see in different ways. And so I've put a quote up on the screen there, which is quite characteristic, really, this idea that the psychology of artistic perception and creation is fundamentally different among different categories of people. And this idea is extremely prominent in the 1920s. We can see it filtering through multiple registers of text as well. It's discussed by quite serious theorists, scholars, for example, thinking about the psychology of image perception, all the way through to rather prosaic and more journalistic anecdotes of misunderstanding, which crop up repeatedly up until the kind of early 1930s. This is a slightly later quote, in the more popular press about Soviet art. I choose this example because it's a particularly sort of light-hearted one, but there are loads of these anecdotes of, especially discussing posters, of posters spectacularly misfiring with their intended audience. And so we have this kind of interest in different ways of seeing being approached from very different perspectives. And it's also premised on a number of very different assumptions depending on who is writing, some of which are just plain racist. There's this the rhetoric of backwardness, the idea that certain nationalities are further behind on the kind of Marxist trajectory of economic development, and therefore we're not merely talking about difference here, but actually kind of value-based hierarchy. Built into that, there are comments that suggest that quote-unquote Oriental people are think in images rather than in rational thought. It's kind of extraordinarily condescending and dismissive way of talking about national viewers. Also, some of those talk about the a focus on a flatness, like an ability to perceive flat images, but not depth of perspective. So we have, that is certainly a kind of prominent strand, but there's also a large number of commentators who are approaching this from an emphatically anti-imperial perspective, and a perspective that we might recognize post-Said as kind of anti-orientalist, even really emphasizing the dynamism, value, and nascent modernity of the Eastern nationalities as they were thought of. And actually the quote I showed on the previous slide is framed in that way. It's this idea that the kind of imposition of European or Russian visual culture on the region would actually, that is what would constitute backwardness, and that progress lies in a different direction. But nonetheless, still insisting on a fundamental difference in ways of perceiving images on a national basis. So there's this, what I have sometimes called, or what I think of as this cultural relativist understanding of viewership, this emphasis on different ways of seeing, is obviously going to be of particular interest to the people trying to produce legible political images. So what is to be done about it is the question. Ivan Matza here, who is a really prominent art theorist in this period, talks about the kind of dual danger that going too far down this sort of national path is just as problematic as imposing a Russian aesthetic, what he calls great power poster chauvinism. It's a rather fine phrase, this idea that kind of a Russian visual culture might be imposed on all of the different nationalities. He suggests that these are both equally politically dangerous. And so artists are faced with this challenge of finding what kind of image might tick all of the appropriate boxes of being sufficiently national and of course socialist, and embody the correct class characteristics, not be too bourgeois nor backward, but also crucially be comprehensible, and legibility is a real touchstone of all of this the kind of propaganda theory. And we can see artists in the 1920s experimenting with these ideas and trying to work this out, essentially. And what we end up with is what I see as a really clear example of a search for usable pasts, a kind of trawl through the existing known visual culture and trying to pick out forms, motifs, and styles that might be adapted and made to seem appropriate for Soviet posters. One such is, in my view, the Persian manuscript illustration, which to my mind is clearly influential. And here's an example in this particular poster of where it can be seen. I feel that in the kind of the delicate floral borders, the handling of the plants and the figures, these kind of scenes of figures sitting around, to my mind really quite clearly recall manuscript illustrations, which were reproduced and circulated in certain journals and in scholarly books of the time. And so it's not, implausible that they would have been kind of drawn out of these reproductions and used by artists in this way. Here's another one that, to my mind, the whole composition seems to be drawn from manuscript illustration, this flattened arch and the kind of the scene in the front with the people arranged on a stage. Although rather less conventionally, it has this quite sort of mechanically inserted scene of a demonstration and the woman holding a red banner into the middle. in an attempt, a quite kind of simple attempt perhaps, to insert an unambiguously Soviet political message into this scene, which is otherwise, to my mind, inspired by manuscript illustration. Now, another potential source of imagery and visual compositions for Soviet poster artists working in Uzbekistan, I think, is the shamail, specifically the Tatar shamail. So a shamail might be less familiar to most people than Persianate miniature painting or manuscript illustrations. The shamail is a decorative panel intended for domestic display. You do have some that are printed on, painted on glass or hand painted, but there was a large of kind of popular circulation of lithographic printed shamails in the late 19th and early 20th century, a large amount of the production of which was based out of Kazan. And so there's this, what is known as the Tatar shamail, is the kind of that school, perhaps. And their purpose usually is as a kind of to confer blessing or as an aid to prayer. They're an unambiguously religious object, or one with religious associations, certainly. But I think, to me, they must have presented an intriguing model to Soviet poster artists as a relatively, or a kind of what they might have seen as an indigenous art form, but one that also set a precedent for incorporating meaningful objects into domestic space, and also figurative imagery, because they often were figurative, although not depicting people, into the Soviet poster. This example, to my mind, has a number of features that are drawn from the shamail. So there's the scroll aspect and these very decorative borders with the foliate motifs and the animal motifs. Although, as you will see, I've picked out that little detail on the right-hand side. Even there, we've got 5-pointed stars and hammers and sickles inserted into the decorative border. This is actually a very unusual example of an almost entirely kind of decorative, in the sense of not being, not presenting a figurative scene. Very few Soviet posters did so. Much more common to have ones like this, which do depict people kind of interacting and living the new socialist life. And here again, I think that we can see the influence of the shamail. I have an example on the left-hand side of a pre-revolutionary print depicting Mount Ararat. And then this Soviet poster on the right-hand side focusing on the life of the new Soviet woman. And in a number of the decorative details, I mean, the borders, the kind of scrolling motifs, but also this overall composition or construction of having multiple scenes set apart in separate borders, with this kind of central slogan. To me, really suggests that these artists working in the Soviet 1920s are actively looking at the shamail as a way in which they can, as a source of inspiration for a visual framework for their own work. This is just another example for you to look at, and I want you to note in particular the slanting ribbons in which the script is written in the kind of diagonal down the sides, framing this really clear central framed rectangle. And bear that in mind when we then look at this poster from 1926 by Maria Nestorova. This example, I think, is really probably the clearest and most unambiguous example of an attempt to adapt the aesthetics of the shamail to the Soviet poster. We can see the kind of the bands of color, the whole decorative composition, and the use of the bands of calligraphy going up to, again, this central building, in this case labeled Soviet. So we have these two examples of Persianate manuscript illustration and the Tatar Shamail as two very different, but two very different art forms and from different historical periods, but that were nonetheless adapted or appropriated in a similar way for the aesthetics of early Soviet posters, especially ones produced in Uzbekistan or the Uzbek Republic. It's worth noting that neither of these was particularly kind of the framing of them as national art, Uzbek art forms is quite problematic in both cases. Neither of them were really sort of inherently related to the territory of what then became Uzbekistan. There were miniature painters active in Bukhara, but the Persianate manuscript is, of course, an elite art form. It belongs to the sort of the medieval royal courts, and is not specific to Bukhara, for example, but is seen across the broader Persianate world of that period, and so therefore not well beyond the bounds of the strictly national. And the Shamail, as I've already mentioned, was primarily associated with Kazan, and therefore, again, framing it as a kind of Uzbek national art form is also quite questionable, as well as its religious associations. And so we can think about, we're perhaps dealing with a quite Orientalist framing of a wider Islamic world, or the concept of Islamic art, which of course has been very widely critiqued in recent scholarship as a category that elides differences between very disparate cultures, because it's so broad and so generalizing, it tends not to be used as an academic category. We maybe think that these poster artists are approaching this approaching the various cultures, both within and without the Soviet Union, as homogenous. It's worth noting that when we're talking about the reinvention of pre-existing art forms, historical art forms, for a modernizing purpose, this is not a case of preserving national culture, as it were, for its own sake, but selectively reimagining elements of pre-existing visual culture in order to bring about a new culture of socialism. So national culture really here is instrumental, a tool for producing the Soviet citizens of the future. And it's worth noting that many of the commentators I discussed earlier, who insisted on the fundamental importance of national ways of seeing, also assumed that these would vanish in the process of the development of the new Soviet person. So to move on then from this concept of the national viewer to national bodies, that is the actual depiction of nationalities themselves in a visual form. And it's worth noting that the 1930s, from the early 1930s onwards, we see a transition away from images specifically oriented towards a national viewer, and much more of a one-size-fits-all approach, even in the actual production processes of the publication process of the posters. We see identical images being issued in huge print runs, and just a translation of the slogan into different languages, which was much less of a common practice in the previous decade. I've highlighted this particular poster, which I think is a really fascinating example of an attempt to visualize nationalities in an ideologically coherent way. We can see here we have the then, as they were, 6 titular nationalities of the Soviet republics, arranged around, in this kind of rather ham-fisted imagery, holding up the red banner of the Soviet Union, which is rooted in the anvil of socialist labor. But one aspect that's particularly interesting is the way in which the frame behind them visualizes nationality. So we have here the 6 nationalities represented, each by a human figure, but also by a wedge of landscape. which links in my mind to the kind of classical, more classical Marxist definition of nationality, also the famous definition as put forward by Stalin in his writings on nationality, which foregrounds territory, common forms of economic production, and agriculture as some of the defining features of a national group. And so we have some examples here of the different types of agriculture, housing, industrial development, etc., being presented as characteristic features of a particular nationality. But of course, we do also have here 6 bodies, and I'd argue that there are a few particular elements of these bodies that are interesting in terms of thinking about nationality. One is dress, which is a really conventional, imperial even, sort of ethnographic way of thinking about group identity as embodied in national dress. But also we have skin tone, hair color, and facial features also being presented as emblematic of belonging to a particular nationality. And I'll come back to that later, this kind of perhaps incipient racialization of national categories. To dwell on dress briefly, the idea that national dress, as I already mentioned, is a really kind of characteristic and defining feature of belonging to a nationality is much older than the Soviet period. This is has a long tradition in terms of the visual representation of national groups. And this example here, which is a really very striking visual image, shows what became, after 1927, or from 1927 onwards, the iconic example of Uzbek national dress, which is the chachvan and the paranji, the face veil and head covering worn by these 4 female figures in the background, which in this example, of course, has been removed by the woman, the main female figure in the front, and replaced by the red headkerchief of the Soviet worker. This in itself raises a kind of a question mark over this way of defining national identity through national dress, which is what happens in the process of modernization. Does nationality through dress disappear as it gets replaced by markers of Soviet identity or modern identity, or that of the industrial worker? It does not disappear in the imagery of the period. If anything, it becomes much more emphatically marked in the 1930s. This poster is perhaps a more kind of obvious return to an imperial ethnographic way of thinking of national dress, in which each of the nationalities is represented in national dress and also holding attributes of the characteristic labor or craft associated with their nationality. And also it's very noteworthy that the Russian or implicitly Russian figure at the front of the group is not marked in that way. He is marked by his class identity as an industrial worker, rather than specifically as a member of the Russian nationality. And this did not go uncontested, this habit, the kind of emerging convention of representing nationalities in this way. Here's an example of a criticism specifically of that poster that I just showed you, which points out this, the kind of falseness of this image, which is not drawn from life, as it says, but from the Ethnographic Museum. It calls it a real collection of curiosities. And so it did not go uncontested, and yet it nonetheless became, by this period, by 1935 to 1936, absolutely the dominant way of depicting the Soviet body politic, and comes to underpin the imagery of the friendship of the peoples, which is perhaps the most iconic set of imagery that we initially think of in terms of the Soviet visualization of nationality and multinational diversity. The vast majority of this imagery was produced around the time of the Stalin Constitution in 1936 and thereafter. But as we've seen with some of the examples that I've shown you, it had been developing for at least a decade already. And what we see, I think, is really the fixing of national stereotype by this period, with exactly this kind of formula of national dress arranged in this static fashion around Stalin. And it really does underpin the metaphor of the friendship of the peoples, because there is, I think, a need to emphasize difference in order for the friendship metaphor to work. In order for it to carry any weight, it actually relies on the fixing of national stereotypes. How am I doing for time? Yeah, so I'm just going to offer a few thoughts by way of conclusion then. These posters, and indeed the whole discourse of in Soviet Central Asia of national art, flags up a number of specific problems, in my view, relating to visual material. This question of how do you visualize nationality, especially at the same time as attempting to visualize modernization and transformation, which is, of course, really fundamental to Soviet visual culture of this period. The first thing that I think is worth noting is that visual propaganda is, of course, a blunt instrument. It's not, in fact, possible to translate the nuances of theory, kind of nationalities theory or policy, into simple and easily comprehensible visual forms. You have to simplify. And I think that is one of the reasons that the visual imagery actually preempted the Stalinist shift towards a more fixed, primordialist understanding of nationality, because of its perhaps inevitable but certainly visible reliance on the fixing of stereotype. Thank you. I think I'm going to stop sharing my screen there and welcome any questions.
Thank you, Mollie. So I'm actually going to jump off here while we wait for some questions to roll in. Again,
Great.
Please throw them into the Q&A function, and we'll definitely get to them. But I'll start us off. I have so many questions, but I'll try to keep it to a few for now. So, you know, your talk is really quite fascinating, and I think that the way you dig into the political, cultural, and aesthetic processes that are involved in producing a sort of viable image of the other in an early Soviet context is super productive, right? You look at how these various processes can be assimilated into the cultural and political collective, yet at the same time, you are really emphasizing this notion that the culture and the aesthetic and the political, these are all sort of kept at a distance in some way, and that there seems to be this real push to maintaining a difference between the center and the periphery. And so as you discussed, the sort of one of the key themes that came out in your talk is this question of communication and how key it is for the early Soviet state. And you know, this question of communication, it also appears in polemics around shaping written and spoken discourse throughout the Soviet Union. And so we have, you know, sort of Rabselkori, the sort of worker and village correspondence, sort of attempt to polemics around, you know, which language are we going to use to represent a sort of official Soviet discourse. And so how do these notions of communicating socialism translate into, or conversely disrupt, a sort of reciprocal discourse in which these new Soviet Uzbeks are able to perhaps reproduce the imagistic and implied narrative models that were meant to be shaping their idea of belonging to a much larger syncretic political and cultural community? And if the political center is able to successfully engage with a sort of local national culture as a tool for communicating ideas external to that culture, can the same be done for those people in that culture with the adopted discourse of the center? In other words, can the discourse that motivates and reshapes political identity move in both directions? Are there any Uzbek artists or sort of Poputchiki's fellow travelers or any other ideal partners with whom the Soviet center can form the type of what they called a smychka, right? The sort of union that was sort of being sought between these different cultural spaces. So I'll start there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great, that's a fantastic question, but a big one, so I'll do my best, but thank you. So there's a couple of things to think about there. One is the viewers. I talked a lot about the kind of the imagined viewer, the imagined national viewer, but of course there were also real viewers out there looking at these images in the world. And there is some attempt, although a very limited one, to actually record accurately people's reactions. So for example, this can be done kind of on the ground on a local level. So where there was, for example, in 1926 to 7, a campaign for the Soviet elections in Uzbekistan, and the people who are administering the campaign do actually make note of when and how viewers responded to the posters. And so there is some attempt to kind of feed that back into this idea of how to make posters, how to make images that do communicate effectively with local viewers. It's a very fragmented and disjointed conversation, though, often not helped by actual language barriers. And so there are a few sort of fascinating little anecdotes in that the campaign employed what they called explainers to explain to people what was in the posters. And sometimes these were party people who may or may not have command of local languages. Sometimes there's one bit of record that describes them as local intellectuals, but doesn't say who they are. And so there is a kind of a more direct, more grounded attempt to make sure that this communication is working, but it's unclear how sort of successful that was. But then, of course, so as well as this idea of the viewer, what the actual viewers are getting from the images, there's also, of course, who are the artists. And the vast majority of images, especially from the 1920s, are unsigned and by unknown artists. So from what I've managed to find, the only posters that are signed are tend to be by ethnic Russian artists who are kind of running art schools. They're already relatively well established, so they're the kind of people who are going to be signing their works. And the records of the actual art schools in the region suggest that there were very, very few non-European students. So even if these are student works, they're realistically being done by ethnic Russians or people from elsewhere in the Russian Empire, probably not by Uzbek artists. There are some exceptions, but it's really difficult, when they're unsigned, to actually kind of find out who is making these. There's Ustonabi Hafizov, who is from Bukhara. It's from this early period, the only kind of named Uzbek artist who I've managed to find. And of his works, I've also only managed to find a few in reproduction. So they're kind of, it seems to me that there's not a great deal of Uzbek artists who are producing these images at this period. And so we can also think of this kind of thinking more in terms of bigger frameworks. There's this circumscribed assent, which continues into the 1930s, the idea that the center can speak at and for the periphery, but the periphery can only speak for itself, and there's a kind of embedded or an inherent assumption of nationalness being a kind of a fundamental quality of an artist from Uzbekistan, in a way that is not a kind of a limitation put on someone from Moscow.
Thank you so much. So I am going to see a few of my questions aside for the time being, because we have 3 from Professor Clary Zine's Modern Central Asia class. And I can give you one at a time, or we can field all 3 and you can sort of pick up what you'd like. Do you have a preference for either or?
Let's go for all 3. If you'd read all 3, and then I'll kind of
Let's go for all. Perfect. So the first question is audience. You touched on this a bit, but what proportion of these representations of the friendship of peoples are being produced for Moscow or Russians versus the Soviet periphery? So who is the intended audience here? Second, who are the artists? You just spoke to this a bit. And is there anything else I guess we can glean from a sort of collective body of an anonymous, or a collective anonymous body of work, I guess? What does it say? What does it mean that we have very few names to whom we can attribute so many of these works? And third, regarding the posters you've identified as inspired or influenced by Shamail, were these intended to be used the same way as Shamail artworks, for example, domestically, or were they used somewhat differently?
Okay, fantastic, thank you. So to start with this question of audience, specifically in relation to the imagery of the friendship of the peoples, it's difficult to determine exactly where posters are intended for, because you often have a place of publication and then not records of distribution. However, I would say that the kind of this idea of circumscribed assent that I just mentioned definitely applies to the posters themselves. So you get posters certainly that are published in Moscow that are distributed across the whole territory of the Soviet Union, but it seems it's not recorded or discussed that we have posters, for example, being published in Tashkent being sent outwards in the same way. But actually the imagery of the friendship of the peoples, certainly, you know, when it really emerges in the mid-1930s, we're already at that point in a period where poster production is quite homogenous, well, in style, but really in terms of like a single image is issued in an enormous print run, much bigger than anything you get in the 1920s. And as I mentioned, just with the slogan or the caption translated into different languages. And so because we have so many these examples of very many multiple editions of the same poster, we can quite clearly see that this is imagery that is being intended for everyone, which is, I think, evidence of this real shift away from the idea of the national viewer. We have this kind of socialist realist viewer, for want of a better term, this idea that this imagery perhaps is assumed to be readily comprehensible by all by the time we get to 1936-37 and this idea of the friendship of the peoples. In terms of who are the artists, yes, I spoke to this slightly already, but yeah, the problem of the body of anonymous work, it's a big one because it would be fascinating and extremely useful to have at least some information about who specifically is making the posters, but also because we are dealing with such a public and politicized form, the individual biographies of the artists is perhaps less impactful than it might otherwise be. These are really images that are intended to circulate in a public sphere, and so I think that's where my kind of focus on propaganda theory and the more sort of public discussion around what propaganda imagery is supposed to do feeds in, to a certain extent might fill that gap that we might otherwise like to, of kind of information that we might otherwise like to find in the biographies or the kind of social status of the people making the images. Yeah, it's a frustrating gap, but one that's not really avoidable, I think. And then the third question was on domestic display. This is very, very interesting, and this is a topic that I've looked at before, this many of the texts, or kind of, there has been a widespread assumption that posters are a kind of street art. They're supposed to be, they belong to the city and the urban space, and they're supposed to be glimpsed by the passerby, which feeds into this whole idea of kind of, they must be eye-catching, they must be instantly comprehensible. And I mean, this is coming from text of the early 1920s, people like Yakov Tugendhold, as well as kind of later ideas of what a poster is supposed to do. But that is not the only, nor perhaps the primary place in which posters were actually displayed. And there is a kind of substrand of discussion talking about posters that are intended for indoor spaces. They might be public indoor spaces, such as the Workers' Club. That's going to be a really classic place of display, or indeed in the context of Uzbekistan, the kind of the Krasnaya Chaykhana, these proper sort of agitational spaces, propaganda spaces, but are also supposed to be social spaces at the same time. So those are a really key place of display for posters. But I would say, yes, I think also domestic display is a consideration. Certainly in the mid-1920s, there are some commentators talking about the need to make posters that are decorative and appealing as decorative objects and as commodities, so that people buy them. And we forget, I think, that in the context of NEP especially, posters are for sale. So they're propaganda posters, but also people might, or there is a hope, at least on the part of the publishers, that people will pay money for them and take them home. And so they're a product as much as anything else. And the local Soviet election campaign that I mentioned that happened in 26 to 27 also has records of people taking posters home and putting them up in their houses. And this is presented fairly neutrally, not necessarily a positive thing, but not a negative thing either, just a way that people are engaging with the material. I think it's quite probable, therefore, that part of the motivation for making these images that look similar to Shamail's is to encourage people to display them in their homes. Yes.
Thank you. And we have time for a couple of more questions. And so if anybody would like to post them into the Q&A or the chat, please feel free. But in the meantime, I'm going to ask you another of mine. And I'm very curious, you sort of went into so much detail, reading the politics and the aesthetics of these posters. But I'm wondering if you could speak a bit to the educational or potential educational value of them. I'm thinking of something like Mayakovsky's famous Rosta windows, right? Where we have sort of ingrained educational aspect, right? You're teaching the Russian language to people who are either illiterate or who, in this case, maybe don't speak Russian. And I noticed in many of these posters, we have the primary text is in Uzbek, whatever the local language is, in often Arabic script. And then sometimes we'll have a little Russian phrase here and there. Maybe part of it is translated into Uzbek. But do we have instances where we see the sort of translation of Uzbek into Russian, or the use of Uzbek and Cyrillic script at this point? Are people being taught to read the language of the center in addition to the political and cultural values of the center?
That's really interesting. I'm not sure to what extent these are intended as ways to learn to read Russian. They're certainly not intended as ways to learn to read the Cyrillic script, because that doesn't come in until much later. In terms of a way of writing the Uzbek language, that comes in the 1940s. The Latin script, perhaps, we could see this as a kind of a way to see an alphabet. My thought is that of the earlier posters, so the ones that primarily use the Arabic script up until the early 1930s, is that they're not necessarily intended as literacy tools. It's just that the text is there for people who are able to read it. Yeah, I think that would be my interpretation of how the text is being used. There are a couple of small, interesting examples. The Maria Nestorova poster I showed, the sort of red and yellow one with the bands of calligraphy, that one, the actual physical poster has the Russian translations written on separate pieces of paper and like stuck onto the surface, not incorporated into the design, which seems to me to be a really fascinating indicator of the context in which that's being used. Like, it's been published solely in Uzbek in the Arabic script, but someone at some point has realized that there needs to be an inclusion of Russian, either because the party employees, the kind of agitators, are not able to read the Arabic script, or because there's an intention that the viewers will be able to read the Russian at some point too. But it's an afterthought in that sense.
Thank you so much. Do we have any other questions here? I'll give it just a moment. If not, I will ask one final one as we run up on our time here. If somebody has a question while I'm asking mine, I will discard mine and move to yours. But you know, I'm really wondering if you could speak a bit more to the question of gender. It seems to be sort of just below the surface in almost throughout almost your entire talk, right? We have a lot of these posters are representing women in various, I guess, phases of their socialist development. Of course, you know, we also have many instances of men being represented, but often you do see, it seems to me, a real effort to incorporate this notion of sort of liberation of women from their traditional bourgeois roles, right? So is there any discourse around, or I guess a discourse specific to, in this case, Uzbek women or Uzbek socialist womanhood? How is this sort of involved in the production and reception of these posters?
Yes, that's a great point. Thank you. And one that I probably should have discussed more during my actual presentation. Yeah, this is a huge element of the whole propaganda campaigns, as well as the imagery, definitely. I think I'll divide my answer into two sections. One is the kind of women as a theme, as it were, the emancipation of women program as a kind of, part of the actual content of the posters. And then there's also the gendered body and how that's depicted in the way, and as a way of conveying nationality. Certainly with, the pan-Soviet campaign for the emancipation of women in a political sense, but also, of course, from the kind of, in a like a day-to-day sense, from the patriarchal family structure and the restrictions on labor and on the kind of drudgery of domestic labor. This is something that is a really big campaign across the whole Soviet Union in the 1920s, but it has very specific and very different inflections in Uzbekistan. One of the earlier posters that I showed you, the one I discussed in the context of it being inspired by Persian manuscript illustration, the whole theme of that poster is the emancipation of women. It's like a before and after structure. Your kind of life before, they have examples of forced marriage, of polygamy, of domestic seclusion, so the kind of gender segregated domestic space, as well as the kind of difficulties of domestic labor, all in the bad before column. And then we've got this socialist paradise on the other side, where your children are educated and fed for free at nursery school, and you become literate and emancipated yourself, and your duty of raising the next generation, interesting that is still framed as the female duty, but that your children kind of become free and become valuable citizens. So there's that whole thematic focus, and that's even before the very famous Hujum campaign begun in 1927, focusing particularly on the emancipation of women, but it came very quickly focused on the specific issue of unveiling, which there was a number of kind of performative public unveilings resulting in a quite significant backlash, and there's this extraordinarily violent moment in which the kind of the public unveiling campaign is revealed for the extremely problematic and extremely controversial topic that it was, and so there's a great deal of imagery around 1927 focused on the act of unveiling as being symbolic of the Uzbek woman becoming a new Soviet woman, and of course we have this the imagery of enlightenment as well, as in the removing the veil and kind of letting the sun in, as it were, but that actually disappears pretty quickly again when it is kind of revealed that this, or when the campaign goes badly essentially, and unveiling does not kind of produce the new Soviet subject in the way that the Yale had hoped that it would. And so unveiling as a topic disappears, but essentially what we get from that point onwards is an unremarked depiction of unveiled women, as if it's the norm, which it absolutely wasn't the social norm in all areas at that time. It just becomes the way that Uzbek women are depicted. And that poster that I showed that had the kind of the 4 veiled women in the background and then the woman in the front with the red headkerchief, the red headscarf becomes the stand-in, the kind of marker of Soviet modernity, and then that gets replaced in the 1930s by the dopi, the embroidered hat, which in itself is interesting because that then becomes a marker more of national identity than of a pan-Soviet identity. So it's a negotiated version of national dress that is sort of acceptably modern, but is also not, but is also sufficiently national, as it were. It's specifically marked as national dress, but is also not as backward as the paranji. Because of the centrality of the hujum and the unveiling campaign to so much of the literature on the Soviet policy in this period, I was actually expecting, when approaching the posters, to find the majority of them to depict women, and for this to be the primary focus of a lot of the propaganda imagery, and was therefore surprised to find that they weren't. As in, there are a large number of posters that do depict women and that do specifically engage with this question of female emancipation, but also there are large numbers of posters that depict male workers, and that do so in a range of ways. There's the kind of the very modernist androgynous body of the industrial worker also appears. And so it's not quite the case that the sort of the female figure in national dress is the archetypal symbol of Soviet nationality. It isn't. There are male figures too that perform the same function. But yes, it is nonetheless kind of prominent in the imagery.
Thank you so much. We could talk all day about this, and I can't wait to read the book when it comes out. But unfortunately, we have run up on our time. And once again, please, for those of you who are able to clap virtually, please do so and join me in extending a huge thank you to Dr. Arbuthnot. And I'd also like to thank all of you for attending today. Please join us tomorrow. Our next lecture in the series will take place tomorrow at noon Eastern Time, and where Christopher Fort will be speaking more to the question of Soviet identity in mid-century Uzbekistan. So very thematic. Thank you again, and Mollie, I hope to run into you in the near future.
Yeah, I'm sure. Thank you all. Thanks very much.
Take care.